Hey, welcome to Helping Families Collaborate with Schools and Communities to Build Resilience in Children Impacted by Trauma. If you're joining us for the second session, welcome back. If you're joining us just for the first time this afternoon, we'll catch you up. The first session was explaining what trauma is, identifying what ACEs was, and now we're going to focus more on moving forward with strategies and how we as parent centers can work with schools, with our organizations, and with families and moving forward with trauma. So session 3A, we're going to look at identify proven strategies for engaging with schools, child welfare, and other agencies. We're going to talk about our toolkit that we have, and I believe Michelle's going to put that into the chat section for us. And in that, and we'll refer to the chat section as we go through. So let's talk about what's behind the behavior. Behavior is a communicator, and we've heard that. Well, I guess we actually need to introduce ourselves first. Sorry, guys. I'm Gaile Osborne. I'm the CPRC director in Asheville, North Carolina with F.I.R.S.T.
I'm Kelly Henderson with Formed Families Forward, and we're a CPRC, which I realized in the last session that we're using acronyms that people probably don't necessarily know. So a CPRC is a community parent resource center. The other thing I learned in the first session is I speak way too fast, so I'm going to try to slow down for our interpreter and our captioner. And we serve generally specialized populations. And so Formed Families Forward, outside Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia, works primarily with foster, adoptive, and kinship or relative caregivers who are caring for children with disabilities.
Okay, well, let's start the slide over again. So behind the behavior is a need. And so many times when people look at a child's behavior, they're just trying to deal with the behavior. And so what we want to do is actually go behind the behavior. What is the need? What's going on behind the behavior? What's the function of the behavior? And understand that although the behavior itself can be undesirable and harmful, but what is that child trying to communicate to us? And so trauma often manifests itself through behaviors when children either cannot or do not feel safe enough to express their anxieties and their fears. And so I like to share that I have two children that I adopted, and a lot of times when there's negative behavior and it's just through the roof, sometimes I'll just look at my son and I'll say, what's going on? What's the real issue at hand here? And it has nothing to do with the behavior that's being presented. And a lot of times through healing, through tons of therapy, through lots of trust, he'll look at me and say, blah. And it'll have nothing to do with anything that's going on here. It could have something to do that happened weeks ago or something that's coming up a month from now. And then you're just like, wow. And so that's what's behind the behavior. Children and teens often do not tell us directly what they need. They behave. They don't have the words necessarily. So they look behind their behavior to understand their needs. Services to address behaviors are often ineffective. So the traditional therapies that are out there, the the cognitive behavioral therapies that we have for kids, a lot of times they're not designed to meet the need behind the behavior for that individual child. And so our kids, they're not responding to them. A prescriptive standard response to misbehavior often fails. So the reward systems that our kids were presented with, they were failing. Respond to the need. Go back. What's really going on rather than behavior. All right, so we also want to focus on transitioning to the function-based approach. So we're going to spend the rest of the afternoon on strategies for supporting children and families impacted by trauma. The key is to understand the behaviors and the responses we see as they relate to the trauma impact. All right, so And this is what we see on the outside, that the classic iceberg. We see the anger, we see the rage, we see the avoidance, we see hiding, we see crying, we see loss of self-control. But what's really going on? And that's that question. What's really going on, kiddo? And so then you look down underneath, and that's what's going on. They're hurt, they're alone, they're overwhelmed, they're hopeless, low confidence, and you can just keep digging, and there's so many things underneath. All right.
Thanks, Gail. So we're going to show a quick video. Before we do that, I do want to just bring folks' attention to the little toolbox image that are on some of our slides. There is a toolkit or toolbox of resources that Gail and I put together. It's in a Google folder, and you should see that link in your chat box. So if you're having any trouble with that, chat that in and we'll figure out another way to get you those tools. Some of the tools were used in the first session earlier this afternoon, and some of them are here. One of the tools in the toolkit is a description of these videos, and these videos are produced by Formed Families Forward, created a couple years ago, and designed to really highlight family voice in the issue of trauma. And so we have 3 videos. We showed the first one, Understanding Trauma. We're now going to show the second one, again, less than 10 minutes, but it covers a lot of the concepts that Gail and I would cover, probably not as efficiently. So we're going to share the video with you, and know that you can access these videos anytime, and there's fact sheets that go with each of them. So there are really good tools for working with families and working with educators and working with even youth to help them understand a little bit. So I think I have to stop the share and get this going. And we've decided to make the closed captions in Spanish, and the English captioner will continue to caption as the video is shown. So chat in if it's not working.
So we're not seeing the video, Kelly.
All right. Of course. Give me just a second.
But the volume was great.
Halfway there, halfway there. All right.
Third time will be a charm.
There we go. Okay. All right. Nope. Let's give this a go again. Back it up. And one more time. Let me know if you are not hearing it this time.
The start of a school day and demands of the classroom can trigger uncertainty and anxiety for students who carry the burden of traumatic stress. Given the challenge that childhood trauma places on students, our challenge is learning to respond in ways that are calming and lead to more resilient young people. As we do, we're creating safe, supportive learning environments.
Kids who come to school with experiences that have created trauma in their lives and significant adversity are coming in with a different capacity to handle the school environment, a different capacity for learning, because they're dealing with a lot of other things.
When someone's behavior doesn't seem to match the situation, this is when we can start to get curious and ask that question of why might someone be acting this way? You know, why might this behavior be happening?
If we walked into a classroom that had kids who were affected by trauma, what gets manifested is a behavior that many adults who don't understand this interpret as, I won't sit still. I won't raise my hand. I won't burst out with an answer.
What were you thinking, right? We ask them that. And then what do kids usually tell us? I don't know, right? And guess what? That is actually true. They weren't thinking in that moment, and they can't actually answer that question.
And the kiddo may respond, and now the next one is, there's going to be a consequence if you don't try harder and don't sit back down or get out from under the table, to which the kid goes, and now I'm really, really scared, okay, and something bad is going to happen, so I'm going to maybe flee the classroom, or I'm going to use language back to you, and now the response ratchets up again, and there's no win.
So we have to look at responding to the need that's behind a behavior and not just react to the behavior that we see. And if we don't do that, we're not going to get better outcomes, both in the moment as well as down the road.
If my son's teachers understood trauma, I feel like they'd be more caring, more flexible with him, more understanding.
A partnership between the Montgomery County, Virginia school system and the New River Valley Community Services Board provides support and training for school personnel.
So when we talked about the science of the brain and the impact on the brain around trauma, it connected dots to why it's so important that we do something that's consistent, that's clear, that's taught, that's retaught, that gives them a sense of safety.
One powerful approach to working with students with trauma histories is the F.I.R.S.T framework. Its components, attachment, regulation, and competency, work together to boost the emotional resilience of students. Core to the F.I.R.S.T framework are strong relationships between students and adults.
The foundation of it is around attachment. And so those are the relationships that are essential for a child, for any child, to be successful. And so there's things that all adults can do to really help to promote that and connect with children.
Make the deposit into the relationship. When we ask the teachers to make eye contact and to make a personal contact with my child, the children basically skipped home from school that day and said, "School was amazing today. All my teachers like me."
Just being there and being available and listening, they're just so huge in helping these children develop relationships with other people, particularly with the adults in their lives.
I really rely on my counselor. I could come up to her, talk to her, tell her how I was feeling, how I was feeling abandoned at home, and she would help me see the brighter things. She would tell me that I'm not alone.
Schools need to listen, not only to parents, but to the youth themselves. Take a few minutes and find out what's going on. Sometimes the kids are trying to tell you things are not right, and you just need to listen. And then you can figure out where to go from there.
Some students may try to describe their feelings but not know the words to use. Understanding how different emotions feel and what they're called is a key step in learning to self-regulate those feelings.
Self-regulation is about being able to deal with my emotions and have a capacity to be able to deal with those in an effective way. What do I do with anger? What do I do with sadness? What do I do with jealousy?
They're at school to learn, so it's not fair to say that they should know how to behave or how to respond in a situation, especially if there's been trauma.
Students are going to have difficulty understanding and managing and regulating their feelings. They might be coming in and having very big feelings, and so they've learned different strategies to tamp down those feelings a lot, or when they do start to feel even the twinge of them, that they could have some very big reactions, again, that don't match the situation. Building relationships with a child is essential. They can help that child with building ways to cope when they might get upset and distressed, which all children do. And so being able to figure out ways to kind of name feelings and to cope with those feelings when they arise. That way a child can then be able to do the problem solving that they need to work through the challenges that they might encounter.
We know in our home that even though our child's face is scrunched and he might have his fist rage and he might be throwing objects, but if we stay monotone and name his emotions for him, I can see that you're really angry right now. Boy, the way you threw that object tells me that you've got a big emotion. Actually guides my child to calming down because he knows that he is safe with me and that I am mirroring his emotions.
Students can learn skills that build competencies and resilience, the ability to cope with trauma, and the challenges and changes that occur in life. These skills can be taught by parents and educators.
And it's helping kids set goals and kind of figure out how do you make choices in terms of getting there.
The work of sustaining relationships, managing emotions, and strengthening skills builds resilience that pays off now and in the future. That work can lead to powerful changes in perspective.
The more educated I got and the more that I learned what happened and that I'm doing the best that I can and that I'm getting them more services, the better my outlook was, and my kids could read that. I laugh more. We do more things as a family. We're planning our summer vacation, and we've never been able to take a summer vacation. So everything is better now.
I started to believe in myself more, and I felt like I mattered more. It made me feel like I could actually do something with my life instead of feeling like a whole disaster and feeling like I didn't belong.
Belonging, learning, understanding. The deeper compassion that students and educators share when they understand trauma leads to positive changes in the classroom and at home. And that lays the groundwork for better learning and schools that feel secure and welcoming for all.
All right, I think hopefully Gail, you're seeing that slide?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So I just wanted to make a note before I pass it back to Gail to pick up on some of the concepts in there. You saw the Spanish captioning. We have now added Arabic captioning too, and our fact sheets that go with the videos are also available. So just know that these videos are available in multiple languages, which we're really pleased to be able to offer. Again, the information about how to access that is in the toolkit. Gail? Oh.
All right. So the good news is resiliency is going to trump our ACEs. And regardless of the trauma, you know, we're starting in a hole, basically, in a deficit mode. And so we know that there are some things to overcome. And we can use strategies to overcome these. And there is hope. And so we know from literature about the ingredients for resiliency. And resiliency is the ability to thrive, adapt, cope, despite the tough and stressful times. And so we want to look at what those things are to overcome. And so first thing is first is that the kids have to have a sense of safety, a physical and emotional safety. And a lot of times that's hard for people to understand because they, you know, our environment is physically safe, but then there's that emotional piece. Does the child feel emotionally safe within your environment? And you have to really dig into what that feels like for a child and ask those questions. Information, you know, do we have to re-traumatize by telling the information, have a child retell? Absolutely not. But, you know, how much information is enough information for a school or a situation to have to know that the child has endured trauma? We know that healthy coping skills will help them get through, hope and optimism, a sense of connection and supportive relationships. And one of the things I really want to point out today is that it takes one adult relationship to be able to pull a kid through. Just one supportive adult positive relationship. In short, people need to feel safe, capable, and lovable. And right now, with everything going on around us, they're especially necessary to support students who have experienced trauma. We've got to have trauma-informed strategies. And those trauma-informed strategies, have to be implemented by that supportive relationship person. You cannot go wrong implementing these strategies, and not only just for children with trauma, but every child. So if it works for children with trauma, it's going to work for every child. And so, you know, really stressing that these trauma-informed strategies be implemented across the board. All right. Back to the comment I made about a relationship being critical. The number one protective factor in a child's life is the presence of a stable adult figure, a close positive bond, one caring adult, just one. And so who is that person for that child? Is it a neighbor that just spends 2 and 3 hours with a child every single day? Is it a foster parent? Is it a teacher that's in their life for 4 years? You know, is it, you just don't know who that person's going to be. The relationship is the foundation of resiliency. And especially now during the pandemic response, prioritize the relationship. It's huge. And what we know about the causes and symptoms of trauma and ACEs, about how the processes of the brain work, is that that relationship can build that trust in that child and heal that brain so that that child can begin to trust. Absolutely, Bob, making things predictable for these children and predictable in the adults. Absolutely. So as we go through the next few slides, we're going to give you some strategies to strengthen the relationships, to teach and reinforce skills to build resiliency in these children. And I am now going to turn it over to Kelly to actually talk about one of the approaches, the ARC approach that was mentioned in the video.
Thanks, Gail. So yeah, there are a lot of approaches, and since Bob just chatted in that he has foster children and kids with special needs, he probably, and many of you may have heard of other techniques and approaches to address trauma, either at a school level or within a family structure or organizational level. And we have just chosen to share this one that has some research base to it. It is not the only approach. So I don't want it to give any impression that this is the only way to go. So the ARC model was developed by two social worker, psychologist researchers, Blaustein, and they have created this framework for thinking about particularly the parenting relationship with children, and bringing children who have had traumatic histories and are perhaps living with a lot of traumatic stress to some felt safety, and developing a set of skills that they may not have at the moment. And so how do we do that? And so they have sort of this 3-step arc of attachment is the A, R is regulation or self-regulation, and C is competency. I want to share, there's a little toolbox on this frame, because in your toolkit folder, you will see something that says Annie E. Casey Foundation's reflections. And we did not copy, we copied 3 pages out of a publicly available resource called ARC Reflections, which is really a way of bringing this information, this approach, to a parenting lens. This information is available free of charge. That's the link at the bottom. Like I said, we threw in 3 pages of it to give you a sense of what they cover, but it is a parenting curriculum that can be used anywhere with any type of family, but particularly helpful for those who are parenting tough to raise kids. And so that is a resource for you. So I want to describe a little bit about the approach. We're going to sort of do it in stages. We're going to start with that bottom level. The foundation of this pyramid is really about engaging, making sure that the families we're working with understand why this is important and why this goal matters. Psychoeducational, why are we doing this? Why are we teaching this? And then routine and ritual. And that is so important, as already has been chatted in. Having predictable routines is the foundation for everything we do and we work with our kids and our families. So then that first green layer is attachment. And the attachment system, as many of you all know, is just the primary system that provides the model for all other relationships. Gaile's talked about the importance of relationship, and that and truly attachment is the foundation of a relationship, that a child and an adult needs to be able to attach to each other. And it is really the earliest training ground for coping with and expressing emotion. And we think of our little infants and that give and take that we have between caregiver and child. And that attachment system provides a safe environment for healthy development. And we know for kids who experience trauma that that's sometimes really hard for them to achieve, because perhaps one of the reasons for the trauma is a mismatch in or missed opportunity with attachment or a disrupted attachment. So what does that look like in terms of strategies and working with families and working with kids? First of all, you have to really be aware of your own physical presence. How are you approaching that individual child who may be in need? Sometimes we're tempted, especially when our emotions begin to rise and our anxieties begin to rise and there might even be a conflict brewing. Our instinct is to get closer and louder with kids, and that is not the way to go in many ways with many of our kids. That does not necessarily work, particularly with a kid who's experiencing a traumatic trigger or is having difficulty attaching with the the adult in the environment. So really be careful of how you're physically approaching that connection. Then structure, really, really important to create a predictable structure and stick with it. Routines, 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 routines. And if nothing has drilled that home, these last 6 months have probably drilled that home in your own environment. The importance of routine. Even though we're lacking that classroom, we've got to create routines within our home learning environment. Another really helpful strategy is dedicating one block of time a day to a purely child-directed activity, where you as the parent or caregiver or teacher or educator or babysitter or grandparent are completely engaged. So the child leads that activity. That is a really good way, and not a hugely time-consuming way. You know, even if you do this 15 minutes a day, where the kid leads the connection, leads the activity, it's really, really powerful. And then transitions. How many of us have worked with kids, perhaps our own, or adults, who really struggle with the transitions from one place to another, from one activity to another, from one kind of demand cognitively to a different demand cognitively. Transitions are tough. And so when we're thinking about how do we transition effectively and build that attachment, is really making those transitions predictable. So letting folks know it's coming, and as calm as possible. Beth, I'm going to turn it over to Gail to talk a little bit about our second building block, which is regulation or self-regulation.
So we're going to talk about learning how to be aware of, how to understand, label, and have tools for feelings and energy states, which basically learning how to, and if you were in our last session, we talked about window of tolerance and how to deal with stress. And so underlying these challenges is often a difficulty for our kiddos, and learning how to deal with the stress that comes at them. And so, we want to support our kids through developing awareness. And so we want to look at developing awareness and understanding of feelings, helping you develop increased capacity, and then also enhancing tolerance for and skill in building relational connections. And that's the whole idea behind regulation engagement. So building on the next level, on the regulation, go ahead and go to the next slide, because I really like the way we talk about the strategies. So we want to help a kid move from the lower to the upper brain. So what can we do to help a kid move from the lower to the upper brain? The first thing we have to do is we can't go into a situation and just verbally correct them. We have to connect to them first. And so I use the scenarios of a kid does XYZ, and then we go in, and just as Kelly said, we have to be very calm about our approach. We can't go in loud. We can't go in big physically. We have to go in and we have to connect with them. And so it may look like something like physically giving them some time, some space, and then walking up and giving them just a, hey, what'd you eat for lunch today? Or what do you want to do this weekend? Or, hey, I like your hair. Those shorts, I like those shorts. Just yesterday I had a scenario with my own son, and both of us went into kind of a fight mode in that moment. It was a scary moment. Both of us went into fear, and both of us took time, and then that connection moment happened, and he had on a pair of shorts, and I was like, hey, I like those shorts. And he just looked at me and busted out laughing, and that was my connection moment. And then I looked at him and I said, we need to talk about what just happened. And he's like, I don't want to, but we need to. So then another idea is that we offer choices whenever we can. Do you want to sit here? You want to sit over here in the classroom? And 9 times out of 10, what is a kid gonna say? I want to sit over there. But they're choosing to sit. Give them choices. Avoid the power struggles. How many times as an educator in the classroom, or even as a mom, that I back myself into power struggles? It's not worth getting into power struggles, because at that point the kid's dysregulated. Gentle, affirming language and gestures. I have a loud voice. I have a big voice. And so I have to find myself sometimes just smiling or giving them a nod or, you know, just an affirming gesture. Or thumbs up. Thumbs up goes a long way with our kiddos, because a lot of times voices have been yelled or been used in ways in traumatic experiences. Sounds really trigger them. So be careful with that. Stand shoulder to shoulder, sit or squat at eye level. Little warning with that, you know, be careful where you put your body, because some kids are reactive. So you need to know your kid you're working with, and, you know, but just don't put yourself right in their face or things like that, but just be mindful of that. But, you know your kid and go there. And then pre-establish, then offer choices for appropriate ways to remove themselves. I call it have an exit plan. When you need a break, when they need a break, you know, avoid the shame that comes with when they flip their lids, because getting over shame is hard, guys. It's really hard to get out of the, you know, save their face. Let them have an exit plan. And I preach this all the time. Make sure these kids can avoid those situations. And also, you know, use them, practice them much like a shortstop would practice them, so it becomes muscle memory. Don't just use them when they're upset, because, you know, when your brain flips, do you choose the best things? You've got to practice these things. So every morning, let's go to your place, let's go to your place, let's go to your place, so that when the day comes and you use the key word, they go. Help them identify that safe place. They need to be part of choosing that. It doesn't need to be all the adults choosing. They need to be a part of it also. All right. Moving on to the next page, Kelly. And then, you know, and if you were in our first session, this is like my favorite slide ever, and I just want to go over it really quick. I think when I first became a therapeutic parent, this was kind of like my mirror in my bathroom. But dysregulated kids, they're overstressed, they're functioning in their downstairs brain. The child has difficulty listening and comprehending, maladaptive behaviors. As adults, we run off at our mouths when we're dysregulated. We say things we shouldn't say. We do things we shouldn't do. We fire off an email we shouldn't fire off. But when we're regulated, the child is able to manage their emotions. They're generally able to handle life. They're functioning from the upstairs brain. We want to make sure that we do whatever we can do to keep them in the regulated area. When a child gets bumped from a dysregulation, what are some things that we can do to bump them down to being regulated? So in the first session, we talked about ways that they get dysregulated. In this section, what can we do to help a kid get regulated? So what are some ideas that you can throw in the chat box to help them get regulated? Just throw them in the chat box. Deep breathing, perfect. Safe place to go, mindful moments, perfect. Take a break. Sensory activities, visualization. Take a walk. Speak calmly, take a break, sensory breaks. Blankets, stuffy, soft things. Getting oxygen to the brain, guys. I mean, you know, Bruce Perry has the regulations, regulate program, and that would be a great way. And it basically is, you know, repetitive, regulate, relate. It's the 3 R's. Safely burn up the anxiety. Exactly, Bob. Burn it up. And in the beginning, cardio. Angelica, you took the words right out of my mouth. Mini trampoline, jumping jacks. We did jumping jacks. I think I've probably done more jumping jacks in my life in those first 2 years of having my kiddos in foster care than I've ever done. Probably more than we all did put together, because I would just do jumping jacks with them. 5 things you see. Exactly, Kristen. And so that's perfect. Brain gym, Geneva. So those are exactly things that we want to do to get them regulated. And then they bump out and we bump them back in. And so if they're not regulated, they're not learning. And then what does it look like in a school? So you got a kiddo in number one that's dysregulated. Number two, we want to listen to them. We want to connect with them. We want to empathize. We want to listen to the kid. We want to empathize with them. We want to accept what they're saying. We don't want to argue with them. We don't want to get in a power struggle. We don't want to, no, that's not the way it is. We want to empathize where they are. We want to tolerate what they're doing. We want to validate, and we want to love them through that. And nowhere in here are we stopping the behavior. We're meeting the kid where they're at. Number three, hopefully by doing all of number two, we've got them regulated. Now we're going to four. What have we done now? Now's when we start to try to shift the behavior. We're going to rationalize. We're going to problem solve. We're going to talk about the discipline, because at times there has to be discipline depending on what's going on. Give consequences, give logic. And I'm not saying we have to do all of these. These are just where number four comes in. But most of the time what happens is, and when we're not being trauma sensitive, number four goes in where number two is, right? And so what we're asking is that we reverse it and we do number four, and then we're back into learning. We're asking to reverse it. So we've got the kid back to the front. And absolutely, I love this photo because we're regulating the kid. And I hope you guys are hearing the word dysregulated and regulated as much as I'm hearing it back in the classroom now. It's becoming more and more. So, all right. And Kelly, this is me. Okay, sorry. So supporting children and families in the resiliency zone, making the zone larger. We want to make that zone larger. So we have that regulated zone. We want to make it larger. So we foster a community of safety. We build trusting relationships. We reduce that sensory stimulation. We create predictability and routines, connect and create consistency across all settings. And let me give you an example of this where, my child was having to miss school for severe anxiety. And this was back when trauma was, very real, very new. I mean, it was very real. It was very new to her. And so on really bad days, she wasn't going. And as she began to heal, we needed to make that zone larger. So she wouldn't sleep at night before end of grades or before field trips or things like that. And so the plan was to hold her out of school. Well, to make the zone larger, the plan change was, even though she stayed up all night, she still had to go to school. So we made the zone larger. And by doing that, we normalized some of that anxiety rather than coddling it. And through that, she began to grow. And so making that zone larger, we had that key person at school. We had predictability on those days. We had that key person with her, connect and create consistency, all of that. And so that's what it ended up looking like. So once there was dysregulation, you got to remain calm and avoid escalation. We've got to teach that. Lean into those relationships. And that word keeps coming up nonstop. Proactively identify the safe places. We've talked about that. We're going to listen and validate. We've talked about that also. And then identify a menu of calming techniques. And you guys have that in a chat. And so at the end of the session, Michelle's going to show you how to save that. So you can actually save this chat and use that as a document to be able to pull out of later on. All right. All right. And the next slide, I'm going to skip over because we're kind of running just a tidbit tight on time. But here's an example of choice and role model and regulation. And so you guys can actually read that as part of your toolbox and go from there. And so Kelly.
So this was just, you've said a lot of this already, Gaile,
Okay.
but the sort of end of our phase on regulation, or the R of ARC, and that is just a reminder, as I think the graphic showed and you've talked about, is that that once that dysregulated sort of outburst or reaction or response has passed, and then the child can be brought back into regulation. And these are the strategies that you could, these are some strategies that you could pick from, but these are not going to sell if the child is still dysregulated and sort of still elevated. So these are just some thoughts on when they are calmer, what can you do? And validation, I think, is, you know, probably the one I would drill down on a bit here, because I think, you know, we get in our habits of no, that's not right, that's disrespectful, that's insubordinate, whatever, my way or the highway, and that we miss the point that the feelings that child has, their response, often response that doesn't look particularly pleasant to us, but is perhaps very functional for them to protect themselves, because they're operating from that very low level brain, that reptilian brain we talked about in the first session. Those feelings, those responses are very valid. And so while we may not like them or necessarily agree with sort of how they've come to this, they're valid. And so validating them first in a non-shaming way, and then talking a little bit from there, using that as a launching point to think about, well, are there other ways? I hear that you're really frustrated. I hear that you're really mad about that happening. Are there other ways then that we can address that need behind the behavior in a way that's going to work for you and for us as well? So that's really that slide. So we're going to move on to the top of this house, this approach, this ARC approach. Just a reminder that all that stuff at the bottom, the yellow and the green levels of the foundational routines and rituals, as well as those attachment components between the child and the adult, are so huge. Spend most of your time there, and then the regulation and the competency will go a whole lot better. You cannot just sort of launch in under this approach. Starting in the middle, sorry, I got a dog. Starting with that regulation is just simply not gonna serve you well, because if that attachment's not there, you don't have the foundation. So we're going to talk just a moment about competency. This is really the hardest and highest level of the building blocks in the ARC approach. One thing I want to point out is I'm just showing this, but it is in your toolkit. It is a comparison, sort of an open worksheet based on what Gaile talked about in the window of tolerance. This is just a worksheet to think about those kiddos that are, or adults, who are at the hyperarousal phase. What triggers you, and many of you named some things earlier in the chat box that could trigger a kid into that hyper arousal, or on the alternative, the bottom phase of what is hypo aroused for them, what sort of keeps that kid. And somebody chatted in school refusal as an example of perhaps a hypo aroused kid. So what are some of those things that happens or triggers those? And then the other column is, what does this look like and feel like? And I raised this is a good tool for working with families, but it's also a really good tool as we think about our youth taking this last step in the ARC model, where they are moving past self-regulation into self-identity, beginning to see themselves as a capable individual who can get past their past experiences and make sure that their future is not a repeat of their past, and seeing that they have agency, seeing that they have skills that they can build, and this kind of tool might be really helpful at that stage, building those executive functions and self-identity and self-development. So really hard. And we know kids that may not get there easily, or may not get there for a really long time, but a really important phase of this. So how do we do that? Some strategies are really teaching about goal setting and problem solving. One of my kiddos was in a session with our rehab agency yesterday with pre-ETs, and they were talking about SMART goals with our teenagers, which was really lovely to see that these teenagers are getting all that good stuff we've learned and taught about SMART goals. So helping them set goals, helping them really work on problem solving Helping them take agency, so stepping back a little bit and letting them identify the problem, because sometimes our kiddos see something very different when they identify the problem than what we would see with our adult lens. Another really great strategy, and I think right now is really timely, is finding ways for kiddos to give back and serve others, because it takes them out of that, I am my past, I'm still living this trauma, I'm still in a dysregulated world, I'm still feeling the effects of the trauma, and saying, I still have some opportunity to help others. And I think that can be really, really powerful. Narrative. I saw somebody chat in about stories, helping kids create and be able to, maybe it was in the first session, but create and talk about their own story. Hugely powerful. And then again, is a higher level skill, but really important. And then really focusing on the child's strengths. Okay. And I think we will talk a little bit more about what impact this has on the school. Gail, I think this is you.
Yep. So the school setting is meant to educate, and it's by the testing and outcomes that they have to get. And I always use this scenario. My babies went to school to start with, and they were what I like to call mama shopping and trying to find safety and security and trust rather than learning. And so my kids and lots of kids with trauma, they're looking internally for feelings rather than trying to do their work. And it's incredibly frustrating for, teachers and educators to understand this in the beginning, especially if they're not trauma informed. And so these kids are the kids that are in the classroom. And will you back up just a little bit? Oh, there you are. You're there. And they're the kids in the classroom that are constantly raising their hand and teacher, and they're just totally just sucking the energy out of the classroom teacher, and they're getting in trouble, and they're needing lots and lots and lots of attention, and they're doing the attention-seeking behaviors. And this was something that was really difficult for me to understand when I was a classroom teacher, and now that I had come out of the classroom and I was working in this role and really digging into this. But children with even one adverse childhood experience had difficulty self-regulating emotions and behaviors. Just one. So kids that just came from a divorced home, or who had one alcoholic parent, or had one parent with a mental health issue, they had difficulty self-regulating emotions and behaviors. That didn't even take into account a child who, had 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6 ACE scores. They struggle to form typical and reciprocal relationship with peers and adults. So here we were trying to put them in chairs and make them sit and learn, and we wanted to teach them. Self-regulatory, here we go, is that R word, another R word, that, we wanted them to be within that window of tolerance. And we wanted them to learn social skills because, those social skills, when we go to the playground, they're pretty important. And what was I doing as a classroom teacher? I was writing them up and sending them to the principal's office when they hit Johnny. And lo and behold, the whole time, it was trauma. It was what was going on in the kid's life and what had happened to them. And, maladjusted, bullying, cries easy, aggressive, all of this stuff. And I can remember, the more I looked into this and researched and things like that, it was all I could do just to sit one night and I had to cry for all the kids that I missed. I knew something was there. I didn't quite know what it was. All right, moving on.
Thanks, Gail. 2020 hindsight, right? All of us have those
Absolutely
areas, as parents, as educators, as parent staff. So, but the great thing is we are learning and we're growing and we're being better, and that's what we strive to do. And so this could be a school, this could be a parent center, this could be a community organization, it could be a religious community. So anything can be, any group of could be, any organization can be trauma informed. The agencies we work with besides schools, sometimes we wonder, have you ever heard about a trauma informed agency? So we really want to share this sort of set of 4 R's. A trauma-informed organization realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for recovery. And so that's the awareness phase. And so you guys are already on that path, right? Many of you are farther along on that path than you know, this is just one of many trainings that you probably attended. And if it's the first, because you're going to see lots and lots of connections, I think, after you take this information. And the next R is recognize, recognizing the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, families, whoever you're serving, students, and being able to be ready to recognize those needs. Then respond. And that's a big ask, right? Do we have the systems and practices and skills in place to respond to those signs and symptoms that we see? And that's sometimes where I get a little nervous, to be honest, when we work with schools. We can teach them all this good stuff about signs and symptoms of trauma, but do we then have a service system that can respond effectively? And I do worry about that, and that's something we really need to make sure is in place. And then finally, the last R is we are continuing to do good practice, do good work that resists re-traumatization. Gail mentioned this idea of having to retell your story multiple times to multiple different people along the chain of command. It can be very re-traumatizing. And so why are we creating systems that make families, youth, make children do that? So here's a deeper look at those 4 R's, and that I really like. It gives you a little bit more specificity. So across the top is realize. What can we realize? Where do we build awareness? Well, we build awareness in brain science that we covered in the first session a lot. Understanding ACEs, understanding the intersections of inequality and trauma. And this is so upfront and personal right now. Make sure we realize our own personal assumptions and biases, and we all have them. Like, we all have them, and we all need to recognize them and do our best. And then we want to infuse those practices once we realize the foundational understanding of trauma. Are we doing what we do in a way that's trauma informed? Are we doing it in a way that uses positive behavior approaches and supports? And are we doing it with an equity lens? So that realize sort of runs the gamut. It's an umbrella under which we have to operate. Do we recognize, are we able to recognize student dysfunction, or in our cases, family dysregulation? And then respond. We have lots of ways of responding. We covered a lot of these in our discussion of ARC. Do we have routines and rituals? Do we have ways to help the adults manage their self-regulation and the kids manage their self-regulation? Are we doing meditation? Are we doing calming techniques? What are we doing to respond to that need? And there's a whole host of things depending on your environment. And then finally, as I mentioned, resist re-traumatization.
So Christine Kilpatrick, this slide is for you. This was your question in the chat, so pay really close attention to this one. So what does this mean for the families we serve? And so in the toolkit, so there's 2 appendices from the Rawson book. And the Rawson book, if you don't have access to it, get it. I mean, it is, and Kelly's holding it up for you. There are big goals. We know not all, indeed, few schools may be ready to offer these trauma-informed services and practices. We know this is a shift. We know that schools are identifying, hey, there's trauma. I mean, that's where we're at. Now, let's take the lead and let's implement, and then even more resiliency. And so how do we get over this hump, that kind of thing. But we share them with you because we want to begin to understand what's possible for these kids. Trauma-informed assessments should incorporate a hypothesis that trauma contributes to some of the learning challenges by considering factors such as cues and routines that can trigger a traumatic response. And so, you know, think about this for just a minute. What are some cues and routines that would create that? Can you think of anything that you can throw in the chat, cues and routines that would trigger a traumatic response? Transitions, absolutely. And for for a child that's been sexually abused, line up in the front, waking up for school. I mean, these kids, they're substitute teachers, absolutely. That's a trigger. Fire drills, absolutely. Bedtimes, all of these things are triggers for our kids. Certain sounds. How about remote learning and not having school and changing the schedules and don't know which day of the week school's going to happen? Impact of stress on student, impact of stress and trauma on performance. Rawson talks about all of this stuff in there, but online, absolutely, Linda. Online is so tough for our kids because a lot of kids with trauma are drawn to things on the internet. Let's get real about this. How many calls, and Kelly, you could probably talk a little bit about this too, but not just kids from trauma, but how many kids are going down this squeaky path because they're online and they have access for online and they're getting into some websites they shouldn't get into. And it's just, it's a bad road. Mother's Day, Father's Day, making gifts, absolutely. Write a story about your family vacation this summer, right? So let's talk about the present level of performance and looking at the behavior. The importance of viewing behavior as potential skill deficit and self-regulation. There are 2 court cases, and we're not practicing attorneys. I have to throw that in here. But let's talk about 2 court cases, PP versus Compton Unified School District and Jane Doe versus New York City. May shape responsibility of schools in identifying and providing accommodations for traumatized children in the future. In the Compton case, and Elizabeth, this is where I want you to really, I think this goes to what we're talking about. In the Compton case, the U.S. District Court rejected a notion that exposure to traumatizing events is a disability in its own right, but noted that the physical and mental effects of such trauma could amount to substantial limitation on a major life activity under 504. That's pretty profound right there. So yeah, so there you go, guys, right there. What does that mean for the families that we serve? It's right there. So we, looking at the monitoring progress, I can tell you, and I like to use stories of my own kids. Kelly probably gets tired of hearing about them, but the monitoring progress, every Halloween, my kids, any kind of monitoring progress goes down in scores around monitoring progress, because that is when the highest amount of trauma happened to my kids. And we call it the trauma-versary. And that's when their behavior tanks, their attention tanks, all that stuff over the years. And they've been with me almost 9 years. And so, I mean, it's in both of their plans that no assessments happen for 30 days before and 30 days after, because it's not a reflection of what they can do. So there you go, Veterans Day assemblies. So, all this stuff, what does it mean for our families? It's a huge impact. So Kelly, do you want to move on to the next one?
I was trying to respond to a request.
Oh, sorry. And I could put the rest of it in there. Go ahead.
For the cases, the 2 cases that are still in the, as I understand, last I heard, that was earlier this summer.
You know what? And I messed up. That's my fault. Let me move on. The next one's mine too.
That's okay. So I just, those 2 cases, and the book, as somebody has indicated, it's Eric Rosen and David Bateman, and it is an LRP publication. And what we have included in your toolkit are 2 appendices, including some accommodation language that might be helpful as you think about supporting families who have children with trauma impact as they write their 504 IPs. And yes, Gail, you're up. You're up.
Yep. So what does this mean for parent centers? So we're turning the focus from what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And that's including adults too, guys. It's totally shifted the way that I deal with the adults. And that IEP case manager that we're frustrated with, or that principal we're frustrated with, or our coworker. I mean, what's happened to that person? Consider needs of every parent, caregiver, child. They need to be safe, capable, and lovable. One of the things that we all really need to do as our centers is review our policies and practices to check for trauma sensitivity. There is a handout in the toolkit where you can actually go through and look at your centers to see if they are trauma sensitive. Do a space assessment checklist, and you can go through and it's in there. Consider how to deliver content to families about trauma and support them in becoming trauma informed and strong self-advocates. Develop or revisit practices for staff self-care and management of secondary trauma. Guys, what we do is hard. I mean, we hear some tough stories, and how is that secondary trauma over time? I mean, it's hard to hear these stories. And then what are we doing about that? Who are you sharing what you're hearing with, and how are you handling with that secondary? How are you dealing with that secondary trauma? And that recovery of all of this happens in, what's that R word we've been talking about all day? Relationships. So that recovery happens in relationships, and then sharing of oneself with the person we are seeking to help heal from trauma and develop that resilience. We cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach, because what worked for my family or me or my situation for my kids and my center is not going to work for your center and your family and your kids. But you can draw on one thing here and there and figure it out.
So we want to go ahead and just wrap up with some tools and talk more specifically about, if your parent is in a position, and we hope it is, to move forward on becoming more of a trauma-sensitive organization, and or you're supporting schools and other community organizations in becoming more trauma-sensitive. I can't remember if it was this session or the previous, somebody asked about community, or maybe it was a question chatted in through the app. Somebody asked about community connections, and I think that is a hugely, very powerful place to be. And in Virginia, we have these things called trauma-informed community networks, where local communities bring together all different folks from all different silos. So education there, family groups, PTAs, the mental health services, the social services, child protective services, courts, all of those private practices, all of them come together and have shared space and talk about how we can move together forward towards building a stronger trauma-informed community. So I think that's extremely powerful. So one tool, and you have this in your toolkit, is the trauma-sensitive school checklist. Obviously, this focuses more on the school level, but it is a really short and easy to implement, easy to administer evaluation. It comes from the folks at the Massachusetts Advocates for Children. You may have seen their trauma literature. They have some really nice materials. And so this is a really good one to perhaps suggest a school partner use, and families should absolutely be part of the data collection on that checklist. The next slide talks a little bit about a process. And again, this comes from the school literature, but it can be used in any organization, and it breaks the process to become trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive into 4 easy phases. And so it's just a roadmap. If your center is serious about this, or your community entity or your school serious about it, is really thinking about what's the process. You can't just jump in and say, oh, tomorrow we're going to be trauma informed. It's not going to work. So you really have to think carefully and be prepared. And that first phase, to be honest, is the hardest in my book, because it's about attitudes. It's about shifting people's beliefs and making sure that leaders are really connected and committed, and that there are tools, there are resources, there's the time, there's the financial opportunities and needs in place. Our communities coming together to do some shared collaborative funding, perhaps, or within your organization. Are you ready to sort of put your money where your mouth is? Put staff time. Are you ready to dedicate staff time to training? Are you ready to have those sit-down conversations about let's do a trauma-informed assessment? Let's look at our space when we had space. Let's look at our practices and our procedures. Are they trauma sensitive? Are they trauma informed? Then phase 2 is envision your trauma informed organization, and that's really important. What is it that we're really after? Where are our goals, and do we have a process in place to evaluate our ability to move there? And then align the approach with other evidence-based practices. We're not saying start over. We're saying, what are you doing that is working? What can be aligned with that trauma-sensitive approach? And then finally, sustain that trauma-informed approach. And that's where, like lots of fads, we see the danger, right? Okay, this year we're going to do trauma sensitivity, and next year it's going to be something else. No, trauma sensitivity is a way of working. And so just like family engagement or these other concepts, that we need to integrate them into what we do on a daily basis, and they need to stay with us. I think, Gail, are you going to talk about this, or I can?
You go ahead, because you've got the link.
Okay, so if you haven't already discovered, hopefully this is not new information, but on the Parent Center Hub website, there is a collection of trauma-informed resources, care resources. And Gail and I worked really hard to put that together with SIPR staff. And it's organized by these 4 areas. I will tell you, it probably needs a little refreshing before too long, because we just continue, which is wonderful that more and more resources become available. But this has some really good foundational information, good places to start in it, and it breaks it into very targeted topics. So if you are in an area that's dealing with a disaster, you can pull some resources from there. If you're talking about schools, there are some resources that are specific to that. Then trauma in specific populations, such as individuals with developmental disabilities, might be something that you have an interest or need for. So that is a really great resource. It's very easy to use. And like I said, we probably need to be focusing a little bit on updating that as well before too long. But a lot of the organizations that are linked in those resources, like the the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. I always have to think about that. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network is in that collection, and they just do wonderful, wonderful work, and have been very active in the COVID world as well. So we need to lean on our partners. And Gail, I'll let you talk about this if you want.
So in the toolkit there's everything that we talked about that was in this screen, but also, in this session, but also there's the ACEs evaluation, where we talked about in the first session, and also there's the resiliency questionnaire. And so once you take the ACEs questionnaire and you get your ACEs score, then immediately go and take the resiliency quiz or the questionnaire, and it talks about the protective factors that are in place in your life to help you be able to overcome your ACEs score. And you'll see that you've got lots in your life already built in to help you overcome your score. And inside of it is lots from the first session, and we'll also put the PowerPoint in from the first session as well as the second session.
Sorry, I was doing too much clicking around. I was trying to get at the comments and make sure that we have an opportunity to address a few. Thanks for some nice comments. Yes, thank you, Lauren, for putting NCTSN link in the chat. The toolkit link is in the chat. Let me just scroll back a little bit and make sure we have.
I watched them. We're good. And Michelle, will you share with them how to save?
I certainly will. Well, first, I just want to say thank you. There's a lot of thank yous in the chat. You guys were great. I didn't have a chance to say it during the last session until we got on together, and I told you how informative and how useful this session is. So I just want to, on behalf of everyone, to do the verbal thank you, although they've been doing the applause and the thank you in the chat. So I do want to let you guys know that those of you who want to save the chat, if you go down to the chat area, it says like to everyone, and then there's like a little square or a rectangle, then it says file, and then next to that there are 3 dots. If you click on those 3 dots, then you have the option to save the chat to your computer. So if you'd like to save it this way, you have all the information that was shared there, you have that. But not too long, these videos will be available, and you guys all have the link. I'm gonna put it one last time, the link for the toolkit that was provided. So you have that also to get that information too. So it's like 4 minutes left. I don't know if there's anything else to share. I think you guys have covered it all. And if there's no other questions, I'd like to say thank you so much for attending. And Kelly and Gail, thanks so much for the presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for all you do, everybody's doing on a day-to-day basis. The fact that you're here in this session speaks volumes. So thank you. Keep up the good work.
All right, thanks everyone. Stay safe and be well. Gail, I'm sorry, do you want to add something?
No, I'm saying bye.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, everyone, stay safe and be well. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.